Hi there. This video will be on the party system in the early republic, which is to say the United States from about 1789 to, we're going to stop right around 1850 or so. I should mention, this is the only pure lecture we'll be doing for this series. I'm not setting anything up. I'm not really talking about historiographical disputes, historians arguing with each other. I'm actually just giving you some information that I think might help you sort of sort through some of the issues we'll be talking about as we go. Okay, so here is an outline that I've made up of the party system in America from, again, 1789 to 1860, which is when the party system truly deteriorated into the sectional civil war. So I'm going to show little bits of this outline as we go, and I'm also going to show it again at the end, but if you want to look at this at more leisure, if you want to sort of think about this list, obviously you probably are sophisticated enough to pause the YouTube video as you go. Before we get started, though, and we'll talk about all of the stuff on this slide in more detail, before we get started, I want to mention two things. The first thing you need to do is put the current political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, out of your mind. There are similarities between these parties in some ways, but there are huge differences, and what will end up happening is you will end up being mostly confused. And it's fine and healthy to be confused, but if you're really married to thinking, when you see the word Democrat, to think of the same party that exists today, that's not going to help you much. Even when the Republican Party shows up in the 1850s, to think of that Republican Party as the same party as today, which is to say standing for the same thing as it does today, that's not going to help, I promise. So please try and put those parties out of your mind. The second thing I'd like to ask you to do is to remember that, except for the very first days of Washington's presidency, when there were no political parties, the two political parties in America were divided essentially along one very large, often confused, not entirely consistent line. And the line was of how big and strong the national government should be. The parties took positions on all sorts of other issues, but if you want one big issue, you're going to deal with the notion that the national government either should be very strong, relatively, or that the national government shouldn't be very strong, relatively. And if you want to know, the people on this side, right here, are generally in favor of a stronger government, and the people on this side are generally in favor of a less powerful government, a less strong government. So that's the through line. It gets more complicated than that. But as you're looking at this list, and I certainly don't expect you to memorize all these names or to necessarily know where everyone is, but as you look at this list, it will help you, I think, to sort of understand that the people on one side were generally in favor of less of a national government, and the people on the other side were generally in favor of more national government. So there's a chance that you have heard of this guy, the first president of the United States, whose name was something like, I think, George Washington. And right around the time when he was inaugurated, it is fair to say that there were really no political parties in America. That's not to say that there weren't political disagreements in America, but keep in mind, the biggest argument of the previous 10 years or so, previous to 1789, was over whether or not to have a constitution, to replace the Articles of Confederation with a constitution or with something else. And in George Washington's administration, most of the people who were involved and most of the people who came to power in 1789 had been in favor of the Constitution. So they didn't have that much immediately to argue about. But that changed quickly. The disagreements soon started, mostly over, and you'll be shocked to hear this, the size and role of the federal government. almost immediately, people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton started advocating, this is kind of a weird little bean here, but you'll survive, started advocating a bigger, more powerful federal government. They started advocating having a national bank, having a small standing army, while Thomas Jefferson here and James Madison started advocating a smaller federal government. So if you wanted a bigger federal government, you sided generally with the Federalists. If you wanted smaller government, you were likely to side with people like Jefferson and Madison, who called themselves the Democrats, or sometimes the Republicans. Remember how I told you that thinking of the modern political parties was not going to help you? Here's where that becomes true. The Democrats and the Republicans were in fact the same party, and historians now, just to make things slightly easier for ourselves, generally call them the Democratic Republicans. Still, even seeing the divide between these two sides, between the Federalists, people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, none of this was entirely cut and dried. Madison, in particular, is interesting here, because he was the primary author and supporter of the federal Constitution, which instituted, as you recall, a stronger national government than the previous Articles of Confederation. Yet as time passed, Madison came to feel that Hamilton, over here, was proposing a much bigger government than he felt was appropriate, specifically by creating a national bank, which wasn't in the Constitution. So you can see how even the principals here, even the people who are most involved in creating the new party system, haven't entirely figured out where they stand. And that must have made it even harder, I think, for the public to figure out where they stood. So it's perhaps not surprising that the two parties distinguished themselves frequently less by policy disagreements than by personal attacks on the other side's candidates. In the two elections in which they faced off, in 1796 and 1800, Thomas Jefferson called John Adams, quote, a hideous hermaphroditical character, whereas Adams's campaign called Jefferson the truest, thriftiest servant of the devil. So, fun stuff, but not exactly a reasoned, rational policy debate. So that was the first little bit of parties in America. You had the Democratic Republicans, who were generally for less government, versus the Federalists, who were generally for more federal government. So that was the way things were from about 1796 to about 1812 or so. And after those frenzied campaigns between Adams and Jefferson, party divisions remained, but the Federalist Party, the party generally for bigger government, essentially died out, due mostly to numerous political missteps, most notably opposing the War of 1812. It turns out not always to be a great political idea to oppose a war that America wins. So with no opposition, the Democratic Republicans staggered on, but they didn't have much reason to stay vibrant. And in fact, they didn't stay very vibrant. So that when James Monroe, the last of the founding generation to become president, ran for president in 1816 as a Democratic Republican, the opposing party, the Federalists, couldn't even decide on a candidate. And when he ran for re-election in 1820, he ran unopposed. So I'd like you to let that sink in for a second. He ran unopposed for president of the United States. No one else wanted it. Now, that political quiet ended in 1824. Remember that the Federalists have died out. They no longer really exist. And the Democratic Republicans are so boring that no one is even really bothering to oppose them. But in 1824, even though there wasn't really a party system in place, there was an election that was so bitterly fought between two candidates who were running, that'd be John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, that the election galvanized supporters of both candidates into creating a stronger organizational structure. Jackson's supporters, who claimed that John Quincy Adams had won via a, quote, corrupt bargain, leapt into action particularly quickly, and essentially revitalized Jefferson's old Democratic-Republican Party, now calling themselves simply the Democrats. Now, it is true that this party, Jackson's Democrats, are technically the same Democratic Party that we have today. There's an unbroken line between them, but that party has changed significantly in the interim, so that to define it back then would make it essentially unrecognizable to today. Jackson's supporters began instituting a sophisticated party apparatus with things like nominating conventions and party officials getting out the vote with big campaign rallies, all of which made the election far more exciting and engaging to the American public than any previous one had been. You can get a little sense of how exciting and galvanizing all this was by this image of Jackson's inauguration. A huge number of Americans truly did view Jackson's election — he was the first log cabin president, by the way — as a validation of America's principles of equality, and they responded enthusiastically to the new Democratic Party's electioneering techniques. His inauguration was almost a mythic event, and if you look at this picture, you can see among the relatively upper-class folk, you can also see people dressed in homespun, people with cowboy hats, people who wouldn't necessarily have felt at home in the halls of power. They're coming to see Andrew Jackson's inauguration too. So at his inauguration, thousands of people descended on Washington, and then, depending on whose version of the story is true, crashed the White House party, raced into the White House, eating food and breaking dishes, and refused to leave. The story goes that finally they were lured outside by officials placing liquor on the White House lawn, so they eventually went outside to drink it. Now, the rise of the new Democratic Party spurred opposition, and by 1832, a group of politicians had assembled themselves into a party they called the Whigs. I should mention, the Whigs is a party name that many people today just listen to and think, huh, what does that mean? But back then it was very meaningful. The Whigs were an old British party that had opposed the king, and so the idea now was that Jackson was making himself king and that they were opposing him, and whatever, the rhetoric got a little heated. But with the rise of the Whigs, the old divide between the parties settled into an equilibrium. From 1832 to 1852, the Democrats, who had presidents like Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk, would generally be the party of small government, a little bit like Jefferson's old Democratic Republicans, and the Whigs, with not quite presidents like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, but with actual but relatively unimportant presidents like William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, would generally be the party of a more activist, bigger government. You could say the heirs of John Adams's and Alexander Hamilton's old Federalist Party. Also, generally, if you were a Democrat, you were more likely rural and poor, and if you were a Whig, you were more likely urban and middle class and possibly evangelical. However, those lines are really blurry, and I should mention that both sides attempted to position themselves, and often did so quite successfully, as the friends to the poor rural farmer. Why did they do that? At least partly because America was made up largely of rural farmers, and many of whom were poor. So in 1840, for instance, the Whig candidate, William Henry Harrison, was supporting relatively comparatively large government positions, but in his famous Tippecanoe and Tyler 2 campaign, He positioned himself as the friend of poor soldiers living out in his log cabin and offering them, if you look really closely, lots of hard cider. So, sure. Either way, it's really important that we make one point clear. These parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, were different on government and economics, but they didn't differ substantially on America's class system or on slavery. Both parties had poor and rich people in them, and crucially, both parties were perfectly willing to tolerate or even encourage slavery. As we move forward, we're going to see that the Whigs helped give birth to the Republican Party, which eventually opposed slavery and gave rise to people like, say, Abraham Lincoln, who eventually banned slavery. But when they were in power, the leaders of the Whig Party were perfectly happy to tolerate slavery, or even, in some cases, push for its expansion. So that's where we're going to stop today. We've gone from 1789 to essentially 1852 or so, just as the Whig Party was beginning to explode under the pressure of the slavery agitation. And as other parties with different views on slavery, that would be the Free Soil parties, the Know-Nothings, and eventually the Republicans, started to strip away support for the Whigs in the North and to render the Whigs increasingly unelectable in the South. But that's a topic for when we talk about the crisis of the 1850s.